Chapter 32. The Plea Bargain. The file that Alexander Sherbakov, codenamed Mr. Pym, sold to the FBI for $7 million contained nothing but bad news for U.S. intelligence agencies and the military. The file cataloged all the secrets that Hansen had provided to the KGB. Even a sampling of the documents formed a startling list. For example, Hansen passed to Moscow U.S. analyses of Soviet nuclear missile strength, including the numbers and effectiveness of its ICBMs and warheads. He also gave the KGB the CIA's estimate of what Moscow knew about U.S. early warning systems and about America's ability to retaliate against a massive nuclear attack. He disclosed to the KGB the super-secret U.S. Continuity of Government Plan, enabling the Russians to discover exactly where top United States leaders, from the president on down, would be relocated in the event of a national emergency. That information took on even greater importance after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on America. Hansen, the file revealed, also sold the Russians several documents describing sensitive satellite collection and other programs of the National Security Agency, the nation's code-making and global electronic eavesdropping arm. He divulged another sensitive secret to the KGB, that the NSA was exploiting a vulnerability in Soviet satellites that enabled Washington to intercept their communications. And of course, he betrayed the FBI-NSA eavesdropping tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington. His treachery killed people. When he first began spying in 1979 for the GRU, he had betrayed Top Hat, General Dmitry Fedorovich Polyakov, an invaluable source for American intelligence, who was later executed. Hansen also revealed to the KGB the names of the FBI's 2 KGB sources in Washington, who were also executed. All 3 had also been betrayed by Ames. By warning the KGB of the FBI's investigation of Felix Bloch, he sank the espionage case the Bureau was developing against the high-level State Department official. Robert Hansen was facing a possible death penalty. He needed a top lawyer fast, and his wife contacted Plato Kacharis, the legendary criminal defense attorney. Kacharis agreed to represent the accused spy. He worked pro bono. The government had frozen Hansen's assets immediately. But Kacharis did not mind. He loved the attention he earned from a high-profile Washington case. He thrived on the bright lights and the television cameras. It was not his first major spy case. He had previously represented Aldrich Ames. He had also defended President Nixon's Attorney General, John N. Mitchell, who was imprisoned for 19 months for his role in the Watergate scandal, triggered when Republican operatives broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in 1972. Another famed client was Monica Lewinsky, the White House intern whose romance with President Bill Clinton led to his impeachment. During the Iran-Contra scandal, Kacharis represented Fawn Hall, Oliver North's statuesque secretary, who famously hid White House documents in her décolletage. More recently, he was quietly retained by Edward J. Snowden, who stole thousands of NSA secrets that revealed widespread government surveillance of Americans. Snowden went public with his information and escaped to Moscow. He was indicted in the U.S. on multiple espionage charges, but apparently hoped that Kacharis could negotiate a plea deal that would spare him major prison time if he returned home. Although condemned by critics and by federal prosecutors for stealing secrets, Snowden's supporters argued that he had exposed government abuse of the privacy rights of Americans and had caused the NSA to abandon its practice of keeping a secret record of millions of telephone calls made by ordinary citizens every day. Former Attorney General Eric Holder said Snowden had performed a public service by opening a national debate over government surveillance, but should still have to pay a penalty for breaking the law. Despite Kacharis's somewhat flamboyant public persona, he was a quiet professional who enjoyed a rock-solid reputation for integrity among his fellow lawyers. The son of a Greek immigrant who worked as a streetcar motorman in Chicago and a Greek mother who insisted he be named Plato, Kacharis had built a highly successful, lucrative law practice. It allowed him to indulge his taste for expensive Savile Row suits, bright suspenders, and monogrammed shirts from Denman and Goddard of London. He grew up in the Maryland suburbs and in Washington, joined the Marines, graduated from Georgetown Law School, and married his longtime girlfriend, Ethel Dominic. A major goal of Kacharis was to save Hansen from the death penalty, which had been restored for some types of espionage crimes in the wake of the Ames case. Attorney General John Ashcroft helped Kacharis out with a blunder. He told an interviewer that he would not hesitate to consider the death penalty for Hansen. Kacharis quickly lodged an official complaint, pointing out that federal prosecution guidelines prohibit using the death penalty as a threat to gain advantage in a possible plea bargain. Kacharis had other cards to play. It would be very difficult to prosecute Hansen without revealing the secrets he had passed to Moscow, and the government was reluctant to broadcast them to the world. Moreover, Mr. Pym would likely have to be a key witness in any trial. Although he was willing to testify, if absolutely necessary, the FBI wanted to keep his identity secret if it could. His true name, FBI code name, and the story of how he was persuaded to provide the KGB file is told in this book for the first time. Robert Hansen was not identified as the mole inside U.S. intelligence until his voice was recognized on the tape that Mr. Pym provided to the FBI. Did the KGB never identify him during all the years he was passing secrets to them? Hansen communicated via dead drops and letters. But the Russians knew when and where he might appear at a dead drop or a signal site. Weren't they tempted to stake out a drop and photograph both Hansen and his car to try to learn who he was? Some experienced counterintelligence agents scoff at the idea that the KGB would not, over a period of 16 years, have discovered Hansen's identity. Because he drove his car to drop and signal sites, it would not have been difficult to photograph his license plate and learn the owner from public motor vehicle records. The Russians could have done so any time up to July 1, 1994. On that date, a new law took effect in Virginia where Hansen's cars were registered, protecting driver privacy. Under the state law, the name and address of the owner of a license plate was no longer a public record, or the KGB might even have followed him to his home or office. But if the KGB placed Hansen under surveillance, they would be taking an enormous risk of losing their most valuable source in America. Hansen was a counterintelligence officer, and if he spotted the surveillance, he would go to ground. He would no longer fill dead drops for the KGB. Apparently, the KGB decided not to take that risk. According to a senior FBI official, to our knowledge, they did not try to surveil him. There's nothing in the file to indicate they knew who he was. Hansen was imprisoned in the Alexandria County Detention Center after a federal judge said he posed a severe flight risk. The CIA opposed the death penalty for Hansen. The intelligence agency and the FBI were much more interested in finding out how Hansen had managed to steal so many secrets for the KGB. The CIA had launched a damage assessment. Getting Hansen to cooperate as part of a plea bargain was the goal of the intelligence agencies. If Hansen was executed, the CIA would never learn the full extent of what had been compromised. From the file that Alexander Sherbakov had produced, the FBI and the CIA had a lengthy index to the files that Hansen had disclosed. But the intelligence agencies could not be certain that Mr. Pym had managed to copy the title of every file that Hansen had transmitted to the KGB. They wanted to question him in detail and construct their own damage assessment. George Tenet, the CIA director, wrote to Ashcroft, arguing that it was crucial to interrogate Hansen rather than execute him. On April 18th, the lead prosecutor, Randy I. Bellows, an assistant U.S. attorney in Alexandria, met with Kacharis to discuss, for the first time, the possibility of a deal. The government wanted Hansen to admit his spying in return for a sentence of life in prison. The prosecutor warned that the death penalty was still possible. The government had a double motive in discussing a plea bargain. In addition to learning from Hansen exactly what damage he had wrought, it hoped to avoid the public exposure of the secrets that he had passed. The secrets had already been sold to the Soviet Union, yet the extent of the damage was concealed from the American people. The U.S. intelligence agencies were appalled at the thought of the public learning secrets that were already known to the KGB, the adversary from whom the secrets were primarily designed to be concealed. A month later, in May, Kacharis and Bellows met again. The Justice Department had still not decided whether to seek the death penalty, Bellows said. He asked for more time. Kacharis, playing hardball, refused and broke off the talks. Kacharis was well aware that the government did not want the secrets that Hansen had given to Moscow exposed in a trial, and it was impossible, Kacharis contended, for the government to prove that his client was responsible for the deaths of the 2 KGB officers in Washington whom he had betrayed. We argued that you can't blame Hansen for the deaths of Martinov and Motorin because Ames had already given them up months earlier. We also argued the government had a statute of limitations problem. On May 31st, Hansen pleaded not guilty in a 2-minute appearance under heavy security at the federal courthouse in Alexandria. Judge Claude M. Hilton set a trial date for October 29th. But Kacharis was not willing to gamble on a trial. "You never know what a jury will do," he told me, "and juries in Virginia can be particularly harsh. There are a lot of military people in Northern Virginia. Virginia jurors are conservative, they are sophisticated, and they might find what he gave the Russians highly offensive." Early in June, Kacharis telephoned Bellows and suggested they meet privately to see whether the talks about a plea bargain might be reopened. By that time, Ashcroft was no longer trumpeting the death penalty, giving Bellows more room to negotiate. The deal was struck. Hansen would plead guilty and promise to cooperate by revealing everything he had done. Kacharis had saved Robert Hansen from the death penalty. The compromise gave both sides what they wanted. Before the plea bargain was finalized, however, the government wanted to hear what Hansen was prepared to reveal. The prosecutors would not sign the agreement unless Hansen demonstrated that he was willing to cooperate. The test, known as a proffer, took place in a windowless room in the basement of the federal courthouse. There were 2 such meetings, and Hansen was given a type of limited immunity from prosecution for what he revealed. As Hansen agreed to enter his plea guilty, Ashcroft, in a statement, said the decision to forego the death penalty was based on the strong recommendation of the intelligence community. On June 21st, Kacharis and John C. Hundley, his partner in the law firm, arrived for the meeting. As the lawyers for the government and for the defense chatted and milled about, federal marshals brought in Hansen, wearing a green jumpsuit with the word "prisoner" on the back. They removed the manacles from his hands. The 2 sides took their places at a long, polished table in the underground room. Doug Gregory and the other FBI case agent Stefan Plea sat across from Hansen and the defense team. The Justice Department was represented by Randy Bellows and John Dion, the chief of the Internal Security Section. Doug Gregory did most of the questioning. Preston Burton, a Kacharis partner, was delayed by a court appearance and arrived late. He realized that Hansen was not performing well. 5 hours later, the proffer session ended. Kacharis and his partners were dismayed. Hansen might be blowing the deal. He would have one more chance to redeem himself at another meeting set for a week later. At the second meeting, Hansen was more focused. After 7 hours of questioning, it was clear that the deal would go through. The court had agreed in advance that the plea bargain would be binding. Under federal rules, a judge does not have to accept a plea bargain worked out by the prosecution and the defense. But once the court accepts the arrangement, it becomes final. In working out the details of the plea, the defense lawyers said that Hansen was anxious to have access to a computer in prison. But the government, aware of Hansen's technical skills, wanted to prohibit him from using a computer, even one with no modem that would allow him to dial out. "Do you think this guy is the professor on Gilligan's Island?" Burton asked. "Do you think he's going to make a radio out of a coconut?" Hansen had another complaint. 3 months after the 9/11 attacks, Zacharias Moussaoui, a French citizen, was brought to the Alexandria jail to await trial in federal court on charges of conspiring in the terrorist attacks. Moussaoui was arrested when he aroused suspicion at a flight school in Minnesota, saying he wanted to train to fly jumbo jets. When Moussaoui arrived, Hansen was moved from his cell to another floor to make room for the new prisoner. In the shift, his privileges were curtailed. For a while, he had no access to books or TV. "I'm being treated like a common criminal," he complained to Bonnie. On July 6th, Hansen, in his green prison uniform, stood before Judge Hilton again and pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage, attempted espionage, and conspiracy. 6 counts were dropped by the government. Larry Thompson, the Deputy Attorney General, told the court that the interest of the United States would be best served by allowing the government to assess the damage wrought by Hansen, an objective we could not achieve if we sought and obtained the death penalty against him. Under the plea agreement, Hansen would be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He would forfeit the $1.4 million paid or set aside for him by the Russians and could not benefit from any book, film, or future publicity. And he was to be debriefed for 6 months about his spying. The formal sentencing of Hansen was not to take place until after the debriefings were concluded, and the prosecutors were satisfied. Soon after Hansen's guilty plea, the twice-weekly debriefings began in the same windowless room in the basement of the federal courthouse. Doug Gregory led the FBI team, and Paul Redmond, the former CIA counterintelligence specialist who led the damage assessment, was there, as well as other CIA officials. Most of the debriefings went smoothly, but Hansen got into a physical altercation at one session with an FBI polygraph operator. After the test, the polygraph operator sat down with Hansen and said there were problems with the results. There was a conflict between his account and that of Priscilla Sue Gailey. The trouble started when the first question the polygrapher asked was whether Hansen had a sexual relationship with the stripper. In fact, she had oral sex with him in Hong Kong. Hansen angrily denied a sexual relationship, and his anger apparently affected his responses to other questions as well. Later, Hansen explained to the Webster Commission that investigated his spying that he felt a one-time event in Hong Kong was not a sexual relationship, a rationale that echoed President Clinton's famous finger-wagging denial of sex with Monica Lewinsky. The polygraph operator told Hansen there was another problem, aside from the conflicts between his account and Gailey's. The readout from the machine suggested that he had not fully disclosed what happened to all the cash he had received from the Russians. Hansen insisted he had accounted for all of the money, but the polygraph operator was not satisfied. He told Hansen he had failed his test, and that as a result Bonnie's pension might be taken away. Hansen lost it. He lunged for the man, who jerked backwards out of the way. Hansen landed no blows, and the fracas was quickly over. It was in the midst of the initial plea bargain talks, in mid-May of 2001, that Bonnie Hansen learned that her husband had allowed his best friend to watch them having sex, both live and later on closed-circuit television. She had reacted with shock and anger. What Bonnie had told her sister Jean Beglis was brief and unforgettable. "My husband is a traitor and a pervert." Hansen had pleaded guilty, and the debriefings of the former FBI agent went on for many months. The counterspies seemed reasonably pleased with the answers they were getting from him. But they were not done with Bonnie Hansen. Some of the Justice Department lawyers still harbored suspicions that she knew of her husband's continued espionage beyond 1980, after he said he had stopped. In March 2002, Bonnie Hansen went to the Justice Department to answer questions by the lawyers conducting the internal inquiry of the case. They took her into the Bubble, a soundproof, secure room for the all-day session. 2 months later, she was read her Miranda rights by the department lawyers and given a polygraph. She had a tough lawyer, Janine Bruckner, a former CIA station chief who had been mistreated and falsely accused of various infractions by the agency, but won a lawsuit against it and received a substantial settlement. Bruckner watched the lie detector test through a one-way mirror and said that Bonnie had passed it. In a 2002 interview with reporter James Risen of the New York Times, Bonnie Hansen said that after her husband promised he had stopped spying in 1980, she questioned him to make sure he was, over time, paying the $30,000 he had received from the Russians to the Mother Teresa charity. He said he was. Bonnie Hansen, according to Bruckner, also said during the lie detector test that over the next few years she asked her husband whether he was again working for the Russians, and he always denied it. The FBI and the prosecutors found Bonnie Hansen to have been fully cooperative with the government, as did the Damage Assessment Group, which noted she had met with our psychological evaluation team to discuss various aspects of her husband's psychological makeup and disposition. The Justice Department's Inspector General was rather more cautious in choosing his words, but concluded that, based on the evidence available to us now, we cannot state that she has been untruthful in answering questions. As a result of her cooperation, the prosecutors informed the court she was entitled to her husband's survivor's benefit. Under Hansen's plea bargain, she also was allowed to keep their house and 3 cars. On May 10, 2002, Hansen, gaunt in his green prison uniform — he had lost 70 pounds in jail — appeared before Judge Hilton again in the Alexandria Federal Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with grim-faced FBI agents, many of whom had worked with Hansen in counterintelligence. Before he was sentenced, Hansen arose and read a statement. "I apologize for my behavior," he said. "I am shamed by it. He had caused great harm to my totally innocent wife and children. I have hurt so many deeply." Moments later, Judge Hilton sentenced Hansen to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Bonnie Hansen and the children were not in the courtroom.